The second attribute of concepts that we'll take a look at here is that every concept has a history. Let's return to our example of the concept of human rights. When did this concept emerge? Well, like any concept, it probably emerged in response to some problem or some question. Maybe someone asked, are there rights that all human beings share? But of course, any problem or question regarding a concept of human rights presupposes a concept of human and a concept of right. Hence why Deleuze and Guattari tell us that when we look at a concept's history, we'll see how that history traces through its other components, which relate to other concepts and other problems. So not only does every concept have a history, but each of its components will have a history of their own, especially if those components are concepts themselves. So let's work our way down through to the concept of human, which is a component of the concept of human rights. Now, it's hard to say for sure when a concept of a human first emerged. In theory, I guess, some human being at some point could have conceived of a notion of a human being for the first time and just never told anyone, never wrote it down. But I think what we can say, even if we're only speculating here, which we'll have to do because this is not meant to be a rigorous scholarly history of the concept, but if we had to guess, there are certain things that we can say would not have been present at a very early stage in the history of the human species in terms of what any given human being would have thought about what makes them what they are. For example, if you asked a human being in the 1st century CE, what is a human being? Maybe they would have been able to tell you some differences between a human being and a non-human animal. They might say, well, we walk upright, we have less hair on our bodies are structured differently, there's certain things that we have that other animals don't, certain things that animals have that we don't have wings or tails, things like that. They might also even be able to say that, well, there's certain things human beings can do. There's certain capacities that make human beings what they are. The capacity to communicate meaningfully, to form language, to develop culture, religion, art, fashion, and of course the capacity to think using reasoning in our thinking. We could say that all this differentiates for us from animals. You might have been able to talk to a human being in the first few centuries of our species, of the contemporary era, and you might have been able to get some of those answers. You would not have been able to get answers that had anything to do with DNA or biology, because obviously those advances had not been made yet. So whatever we want to say about the history of the concept of a human, we can say with some certainty, I think, that human beings in the first few centuries of the Common Era would not have been able to say that a human being is different from a fish based on anything other than phenotypical attributes. In other words, attributes you can observe just with the naked eye. But if you ask a human being in the 21st century, what makes a human being, they would certainly include these phenotypical attributes and these capacities, but they would also be able to include the genotypical attributes. They would be able to say, well, the DNA of a human being is different from that of a fish. But what about the concept of a human being as a philosophical concept? Because all this stuff is not really that philosophical. A philosopher would formulate a conception of a human being that would abstract from this stuff, maybe ask what some of the implications of this stuff would be. If you asked, say, Socrates what his conception of a human being is, he might say it has something to do with a soul, that a soul is incarnated in a fleshy body. If you asked a philosopher like Karl Marx what he thinks a human being is, I can guarantee you he would not include any notion of a soul in his conception of a human being, since he denied the existence of such things. So the concept of a human being as a philosophical concept obviously would have had to emerge after philosophy. And over the history of philosophy has developed and changed. And many philosophers between those two that I've mentioned and since have come up with their own conceptions. And it's still in development, you could argue. Let's take a look at the concept of a right. Earlier human beings might have said that a right is something given to us by God. Maybe people would think we're the dominant species on Earth, and that's because God made it so. And therefore, God gives us the right to take and use what we find in the world, including resources, animals, plants, things like that. A right comes to us from God, because God created everything, is in charge of everything. So if anybody's going to be doling out rights, it's going to be God. As philosophy developed along with society and technology and science and all of the endeavors that the human species has engaged in throughout its development, as all of these things developed, shifted, and evolved, the concept of God's authority has arguably eroded in many of these disciplines, maybe with the exception of theology, obviously. But when you get to like the medieval philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, who came up with the concept of the social contract, rather than say that a right is conferred on us by God, Hobbes says that a right is conferred on us by our society. And it's conferred usually in exchange for something else. Throughout history, there's been examples of attempts to codify rights, which is a very specific activity, very interesting one, like the Magna Carta in the 1200s, the Declaration of the Rights of Man during the French Revolution, the United States Bill of Rights in the late 18th century. What's interesting about these, there are two things that's interesting. First of all, is that these codifications of rights in all of these examples, they were not all inclusive. There were always people that were left out. We'll talk about that in 1 second. The other thing that's interesting is that each of these necessarily presupposes earlier concepts of rights. So when someone sits down to write the Declaration of the Rights of Man, you know for a fact that it was heavily influenced by Enlightenment thought, by Enlightenment writers and thinkers. This is how the writers of the Declaration of Rights of Man developed many of their ideas. So these codifications of rights in the form of documents or declarations provides a nice textual example of the way in which a concept's history develops over time. When you're looking at one of these documents, you're looking at a node on the timeline of a concept, in this case, the concept of rights. And if you were going to do a more rigorous scholarly history of a concept, of a philosophical idea, that would be what you would do. You would look at the text, you would look at the writings of philosophers. The other thing that's interesting about these documents has to do with the way in which they excluded groups of people from them. They didn't include everybody. And to connect this to Deleuze and Guattari's work, remember that Deleuze and Guattari tell us a concept's components define that concept. They establish the boundaries. They establish what is not that concept. What they leave out, I think, is very crucial. They don't really talk about this too much, which is that different people will have different ideas about what concepts should be, what components should be included in a given concept. And I think documents like these are a great example of that. Take the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Declaration of the Rights of Man excluded women. This is even though the women played such a huge part in the revolution with the March on Versailles, with taking the king and queen and just incredibly just removing them from their palace. That apparently wasn't enough. The U.S. Bill of Rights, obviously this has changed over time, but the first instantation of the United States Bill of Rights excluded a lot of groups of people: indigenous Americans, women, blacks, anyone who didn't own land. What did they exclude them from, ultimately? They excluded them from the category of human. Why does this matter? Maybe it seems obvious. Or maybe it seems overly metaphorical. I don't think so. I think it's interesting. It gives us an insight into the way that people think. For whatever reason, it seems like people have a better grasp on what constitutes a right than they do on what constitutes a human being. Maybe this is changing, maybe this is getting better, but I think from these examples in history, that's what I see. Because if they didn't have an understanding of what constitutes a right, if they didn't have an understanding that such a concept mattered, they wouldn't write these documents. They wouldn't fight wars over these rights. They understand the concept of right. What they didn't understand was the concept of who is a human being, what counts as a human being, who is included in that category. One of my favorite movies has a great scene that encapsulates this. The 1980 film The Elephant Man by David Lynch. John Merrick is walking through a train station, and these people realize who he is, and they start harassing him and getting in his face, and he falls down, and then he cries out, "I am a human being." It's a very moving scene. Those people didn't recognize that he was a human being. But they probably recognized that people have a right to expect not to be harassed in the train station, not to be pushed onto the ground. They wouldn't want someone doing that to them, and if they thought everyone should be able to do that, then they would be doing it to each other. But they just did it to him. They probably understood that people have a right to expect not to be harassed out in public. But that's just the thing. They didn't recognize him as a person. They didn't think he was a human being. Maybe intellectually, if you asked them, do you think he's a human being, maybe they would have just said that they did, but their actions seem to say otherwise. Deleuze has a reputation for being kind of an ivory tower philosopher, an academic whose work doesn't really have any real-world applications. But in looking at this concept of human rights, using the terms and focus points that they identify in this part of the chapter, I think we've hit on a really interesting insight into the way people think about social problems and inequalities. And it also gives us an interesting insight into the way social movements have expressed themselves throughout history. One of the most famous examples I can think of is there's a photo of black men protesting in the civil rights movement during the 1960s, wearing these signs around their neck that say 4 words. I have to count there. They have 4 words on the sign that says, "I am a man." Very simple message, but very powerful message. What they're implying by using those signs in their demonstrations is they're pointing out a contradiction in the society they live in. They're saying this society recognizes that a man should be treated with respect and dignity and given certain freedoms. Yet I am a man and I'm not being given those freedoms and those respect and dignity. So there's a contradiction in your society. All that is contained in those 4 simple, powerful words. And it speaks to this idea that we're exploring here, that what a concept includes and what it excludes can have real social important implications. I do believe that the reputation Deleuze has as an ivory tower philosopher is not totally without justification. I think there's a lot of his work that certainly would count as philosophy for other philosophers more than laypersons. But I don't think that's true of all of his work. And I guess that's something I feel like I've uncovered just in my own reading of this book, and I hope that others are uncovering their own insights in reading this book. That's what reading Deleuze really is about. It's not just about understanding what he's saying. It's also about using philosophy the way that he uses it. It's like riding a bicycle. There's only so much you can get out of thinking about or talking about riding a bike. Eventually, you've just got to get on and pedal. The only thing with Deleuze and Guattari is they don't let you use any training wheels.